Hello everyone. We are very happy to have you all here. My name is Jenny Castillo, and I am the Regional Engagement Director with the Southern Economic Advancement Project. In a great partnership with Fair Count and the National Conference on Citizenship, we are very glad to provide inaugural briefing on the data, research, and ideas that will guide the South's shift from response to recovery in the months and years to come. Welcome to Pandemic to Prosperity webinar. COVID, quarantining, and social distancing seemed like just a 2-week commitment a couple of months ago, but now we are here a year later. The South has been on everyone's mind, and at a minimum, you've gotten a text or 7 about Georgia. The South is described in many ways. For some, it's the home of fried chicken and sweet tea. For others, it's home. And for us, it's the 12 states that make up the region: Virginia, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, Arkansas, Tennessee, Mississippi, Kentucky, North Carolina, South Carolina, West Virginia, and Louisiana. I wanted to provide a brief overview of today's program. We will be hearing from Denice Ross, the director of the National Conference on Citizenship, with Dr. Allison Plyer, the chief demographer of the Data Center of Southeast Louisiana. We will then hear from our friends at Fair Count, Rebecca DeHart, CEO, and Dr. Jeanine Abrams McLean, Fair Count VP, and my colleague, Dr. Sarah Beth Gehl, with the Southern Economic Advancement Project and serves as our research director. We also have a special guest, Hillary Holly from Fair Count, and the incomparable Stacey Abrams. She's my best friend, y'all. We will also welcome your questions in the chat, and we'll have time to answer some of these questions during our Q&A. To help set the room, please welcome Denice and Allison. Allison Plyer is the chief demographer for the Data Center of Southeast Louisiana. Dr. Plyer is an international expert in disaster recovery trends and author of the New Orleans Index series, developed in collaborations with Brookings to track the state of the recovery post-Katrina. Denice Ross, with the National Conference on Citizenship, has spent the last 2 years working on contingency plans for the 2020 census. She co-founded the White House Police Data Initiative as a Presidential Innovation Fellow in 2014, and prior to that, launched the City of New Orleans Open Data Initiative. Please welcome Denice and Allison to the stage.
Thank you, Jenny. It's been 1 year since COVID was first announced on U.S. soil, believe it or not. And history has shown that crises accelerate pre-existing trends and disparities and permanently change societies and civic life. The next months and years will be defined by the recovery, and an equitable recovery requires data. Yesterday, we published the latest installment of our Pandemic to Prosperity data series that tracks the recovery from the pandemic. In collaboration with the team at Fair Count and the Southern Economic Advancement Project and their South Strong initiative, we are pulling out the most relevant data from that report to shine a spotlight on Southern states. To get us started, I'll hand it over to Emily Lockman, our lead data analyst at NCOC.
Thank you. The purpose of the Pandemic to Prosperity South series is to serve as a trusted, relevant, highly vetted source of information crucial for steering American society towards a fair and complete recovery. For decades, the American South has lagged on nearly every indicator of prosperity and equity. But local wisdom and ingenuity often form the basis for solutions to entrenched problems that can lead the way for the entire nation. Our primary audience is people like you, community leaders, policymakers, government officials, philanthropists, and anyone trying to wrap their head around what this pandemic has done to our country and our people.
Pandemic to Prosperity is inspired by a report series we published here at the Data Center to track New Orleans post-Katrina recovery. We published the New Orleans Index on a regular basis so that everyone from grassroots to grass tops had access to a shared base of information that tracked changing conditions over time. It helped homeowners see how quickly their neighborhoods were coming back so they could make decisions about rebuilding. It helped nonprofits advocate for greater funding for renters because there was a strong bias from government and philanthropy to help homeowners. It even helped increase recovery funding from federal and philanthropic sources because it reduced uncertainty, and decision makers like data to inform their funding decisions. Overall, disasters create huge demand for data to help everyone better understand rapidly changing conditions. So in Pandemic to Prosperity, we measure how COVID has affected lives and livelihoods. On the next slide, you can see this. But we also track measures that will be important for recovery, such as high-functioning governments and civic institutions, and more importantly, metrics that assess how people are doing during the pandemic across geography, race, and gender. So today, we'll be previewing the indicators highlighted on this slide, and the full report will come out next week.
Next slide, please. I'll start with a map of new COVID cases in the last week, adjusted by population. The dark red areas represent counties with the highest rates of new infections in the last week. In the 6 months we've been publishing this report, we've typically focused on the hotspots of COVID activity, but it's easier to comment now about the few parts of the country that seem to be faring a little bit better: the Northwest, the Northern Great Plains, and Maine. The entire South is currently a COVID hotspot, with Morgan County, Kentucky having one of the highest rates of new infections. More than half of the 1,500 people incarcerated at the Eastern Kentucky Correctional Complex have COVID. Back in July, when we published the first Pandemic to Prosperity report, when I'd researched local news articles to understand the reason behind COVID spikes in a given county, there'd be stories about clusters in nursing homes, prisons, workplaces, weddings, and bars. But now, for the most part, the spread is so broad that you usually cannot tie it to a given event or institution. With COVID running rampant through communities in the South, vaccines take on a greater urgency. Next slide, please. States each received a delivery of vaccines proportional to their population. So the percent of people given at least one shot is a good metric for how well the local rollout is going in a state. In this slide, those are the green boxes. As you scan down the list, the green box gets darker as the percentage of people who have gotten at least one shot goes up. The first 7 southern states are lower than the national average, with Alabama ranking last in the nation for vaccine rollout. The next 5 southern states are outperforming the national average with the vaccine rollout. In fact, West Virginia is the second in the nation behind Alaska. So what's going on in West Virginia? For one thing, they do not have as many national chain pharmacies, so they had to bypass the federal program that partnered with CVS and Walgreens, and instead delivered the vaccine directly to local, mostly independent pharmacies. These pharmacies already had relationships with the patients in the nursing homes that were going to be the first priority. So the state piggybacked onto those existing networks. By the time the vaccine was ready, pharmacists in West Virginia had already scheduled appointments with many of those who needed shots. Because West Virginia is more rural and the vaccine rollout is smaller, they were able to be more agile than states with larger populations that had to work with the bureaucracy of the national pharmacy chains. West Virginia was the first state to vaccinate all of its nursing home residents and staff. And what's happening in Alabama, where the CDC data says that the state has used less than 1/3 of the doses it's been given. That's the column in the far right on this table. Well, that number appears to be a reflection of problems with data reporting. Providers are not reporting the shots they've administered to the state in a timely manner. It is very likely that Alabama has given more shots than are reported, but because those counts aren't making it to the CDC, the feds won't authorize more vaccine shipments. From what the feds can tell, the freezers in Alabama are still full, so there's no room for more vaccines. The bottom line is that insufficient data reporting infrastructure is not only making it hard to understand how the rollout is going across and within states, but also data reporting problems will actually slow down the delivery of needed vaccines. Next slide.
Across the South, 1.5 million jobs have disappeared in the past year. When December jobs data comes out for states, it's likely to show an even greater loss. We know, for example, that the nation as a whole lost 140,000 jobs in December, in a month when jobs usually increase due to holiday spending. The COVID economic crisis has been particularly hard on women, who have disproportionately lost jobs. The nation's not likely to regain many of these jobs until the pandemic is under control. Next slide, please. Small businesses have differed in their impact. States have differed in their policies to stop the virus's spread, but consumer buying behavior has changed dramatically overall, and this has hit many small businesses hard. Tourism-heavy states like Louisiana and Florida have been particularly impacted. These are the lines below the dark line, the dark red line on this chart. Latinx-owned businesses are roughly twice as likely as white-owned businesses to have closed, and Black-owned businesses were about 2.5 times more likely to have closed than white-owned businesses. Next slide, please. Compounding the injuries of this incredible year, 2020 was a record breaker for weather and climate disasters. In dark brown, you can see the states with the greatest damage per resident. 6 hurricanes causing at least $1 billion in damage hit the South. 3 of them hit Louisiana. Also, the scale of disasters starting with Katrina are much larger than in past, and local governments are rarely well equipped to respond to all the human needs for housing, transportation, and mental health supports that last for months afterwards as communities really struggle to rebuild. Moreover, because of arduous application processes that are really overly focused on rooting out fraud, only those families and governments with the greatest capacity successfully secure recovery resources. And because of this, disasters have been shown to increase inequity. Now I'll briefly hand it over to Jeff Coates, NCOC's research director and the leader of the organization's Civic Health Index Initiative.
The economic crisis spurred by COVID harmed states directly, especially in terms of reduced income and sales tax revenue. For example, in fiscal year 2020, West Virginia suffered an 11% reduction of around $500 million. Those losses were due in large part to unemployment, pushing down personal income, and consumer sales tax collection. All these numbers are evolving almost daily as state governments are currently working on their budgets. For fiscal year 2021, 4 states in the South are projecting a tax revenue reduction of 10%, seen in red. Tennessee relies heavily on sales tax, and due to COVID, consumer spending has dropped significantly, causing a loss of revenue for the state. Florida's reduction is due in part to reduced tourism and unemployment. A similar story can be seen in North Carolina. Louisiana has been impacted not only by unemployment and disasters, but also loss of revenue in the mineral and oil industries. As mentioned in SEEP's Southern State Economic Response to Pandemic report at the beginning of the pandemic, the loss of revenue will impact states' ability to deliver effective public assistance programs during the pandemic. The impact is felt more in southern states because they already have some of the lowest taxing states. Also troubling is the impact that these reductions could have on the state's ability to mount a robust public health response to COVID. For example, a recent NPR survey found that only 2 states, Hawaii and Montana, are appropriately staffed for contact tracing. Next slide.
This map shows what percentage of households responded on their own to the census, by phone, internet, or paper. Research shows that groups less likely to self-respond are more likely to be undercounted. There's a 15 percentage point gap between the self-response rates for Louisiana and Mississippi and that of Minnesota. The gap between West Virginia and Minnesota is 19%. After the self-response phase, the census, especially in the South, experienced extreme headwinds due to the pandemic, hurricanes, and intense politicization of what should be a non-political process. For example, most of the state of Louisiana was in a hurricane watch cone for 20 days during the census. As a result, the follow-up process of knocking on doors was cut short. Lower self-response rates coupled with the subsequent barriers to a complete count may impact the fair apportionment of political power and money among states to a degree that is yet to be measured. States and jurisdictions can support granting the Census Bureau more time to complete its work and can advocate for a more robust process for including additional local data, for example, records from group quarters. Next slide.
This slide looks at the raw number of ballots cast in the 2020 presidential election, which jumped substantially compared to 2016. We point out 4 southern states in particular on this slide. Voters in Florida increased by 1.5 million, in Georgia by over 800,000, in North Carolina by nearly 800,000, and in Virginia by more than 500,000. And of course, these are the most populous states, so they would have larger raw increases. Next slide, please. Here we overlaid 2020 voter turnout rates. Those are the dots that you can see there, and they're relative to the scale on the right side of the graphic. So we see that in the South, voter turnout of all eligible voters ranged from 56% in Arkansas to 72% in Florida. Now, nationwide, it's estimated that only 66.7% of voters participated, as depicted in the horizontal line across the chart. Many northern states achieved even higher voter turnout, for example, Minnesota at 80%. So looking at the South, substantial continued effort to engage voters and combat voter suppression could yield even more balanced cast in future elections. Of course, challenges remain because of the gutting of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, current voting restrictions codified in law, and expected legislative efforts to make it harder to vote rather than easier in the South. Later in this presentation, you'll hear with specificity about some of those efforts. Next slide.
Trusted local news sources are key to the success of public health campaigns, countering mis and disinformation, holding local governments accountable, and for getting the word out about testing and vaccinations. Half of counties in the United States are what experts describe as local news deserts that have either no newspaper or often only one, only one weekly or thinly staffed daily. News deserts are colored orange in this map. But fully 2/3 of Southern counties are news deserts, meaning a critical vehicle for trusted information during the pandemic is absent. Next slide, please. Local newspapers are especially critical as we enter, local newspapers are especially critical as we enter the vaccination phase of the pandemic. For example, when vaccines opened up for residents ages 65 and older, the South Central Health District in Middle Georgia was concerned about how they would get consent forms to eligible residents, as there was no budget for printing. Many health districts get around this by posting their forms online so residents can print them at home or submit them electronically. However, most of the residents in that area do not have access to the internet, much less a printer. The Tri-County Connector newspaper published the consent form for the vaccine on the front page of their newspaper so residents could simply cut the form out of the paper, fill it out, and bring it to the vaccine site. You can see the form here above the fold on the right in last week's newspaper.
Next slide, please.
Southern states have less internet access as a whole than the nation, represented in dark blue on this map. At least 1 in 5 people lack a computer and internet access in the South, and fully 1 in 3 people lack a computer and internet in 5 Southern states. In rural areas of America, there are fewer broadband providers and slower internet speeds. One study from 2018 found that the majority of rural residents in the US felt access to high-speed internet was a significant problem. Lack of access to the internet has especially harmful consequences during the pandemic, as it limits safe access to telehealth, education, news, worship, and communication with the outside world. Troubling anecdotes are emerging of the internet savvy snatching up limited vaccine appointments, leaving none for those who need to schedule by phone. Reliance on the internet for education has also become paramount this year, and children without access are already falling behind. And on this next slide, we can see that internet access is a strong indicator of racial inequity in the United States. According to the most recent data about the South, roughly 1 in 5 Indigenous and Black individuals, represented by the bars on the left, live in homes without computers and internet access, compared to only 11% of white people and 5% of Asian people. School-age Black and Indigenous children are particularly at risk of learning loss, where instruction has moved to all virtual during the pandemic, especially as state governments and school districts fail to ensure all children have access to needed equipment and internet connectivity. On this next slide, we see that the lack of internet access, students acting as caretakers or taking jobs, and decreased services for students with disabilities have all contributed to an observable drop in school attendance among K-12 students during the pandemic. Education think tank Bellwether Education Partners looked at available data on English learners, students in foster care, and other vulnerable groups to estimate that 260 to 670,000 students could be missing from Southern schools based on vulnerable populations in each state. Anecdotal evidence is available from some school districts, such as a survey done in South Carolina, which reported that only 17% of teachers had contacted all of their students, and about 21% of teachers said they had been in contact with less than half of the students in their class. But actual and comprehensive school attendance data is not available to determine the full scale of this issue. In the meantime, it is clear that these initial estimates point to a drastic problem for students this year. If we can go to the next slide, we see that COVID job losses and higher food prices have exacerbated families' challenges putting food on the table. While 14% of the United States has reported food insecurity during the past several weeks, Southern states have fared even worse. On this map in dark brown, you can see that nearly 1 in 5 adults in Louisiana and Mississippi report sometimes or often going hungry during the pandemic. A steep survey of SNAP recipients across the South found that half had trouble accessing public benefits such as SNAP, unemployment, or stimulus payments. Challenges including difficult websites, busy phone lines, and long wait times have led to this issue.
All right, thanks for hanging with us during this whirlwind preview of many of the indicators we'll be publishing on next Thursday, January 28th. We're incredibly lucky that this data is available. Data transparency is not a given, and organizations that continually fight for the ongoing collection and dissemination of data are necessary for a clear view of the crisis. So I'd like to close with a huge thank you to all of the data heroes in state, local, federal government, institutions, nonprofits, and volunteer organizations who make these types of analyses possible. Here's our contact information if you'd like to reach out, or if you'd like to access the nationwide Pandemic to Prosperity report we published yesterday. And now I'll turn it over to our colleagues at Fair Count.
Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Rebecca DeHart, the CEO of Fair Count, and I'm with our Vice President, Dr. Jeanine Abrams McLean, and we are absolutely thrilled to be launching Pandemic to Prosperity South with our incredible partners on this call, our supporters, including the Resilient Democracy Fund. This morning, we're going to talk a little bit about our work at Fair Count, the connection between strong civic engagement and COVID recovery, and give a few examples of programs we will launch later this year. Fair Count was founded to achieve a fair and accurate count in the 2020 census while strengthening pathways to continued civic participation. We're anchored in Georgia, but we've worked in more than a dozen states, focusing on building long-term power in historically marginalized communities that many in power wanted to silence. Our work transcends specific engagement efforts, as while the particular effort, the census, the election, redistricting, the American Community Survey is the goal, these efforts largely are catalysts for the ultimate goal, which is to build long-term participatory power in communities that are undercounted in the census, underrepresented at the polls, and pulled apart in redistricting. So as the indicators presented just now by our partners NCOC suggest, building long-term civic power and forging a path to COVID recovery are very much intertwined. We could ask and have a very real discussion about a potential correlation between Minnesota's 80% plus voter turnout and the success rate of their vaccination distribution program. Just as we could ask ourselves about the critical undercount in the 2020 census in the southern states and how it relates to the dysfunction of data collecting and reporting by state, as evidence in struggling vaccine distribution programs thus far. However, we have those conversations, and we will through this effort that we're launching today. Fair Count knows that we cannot build power, raise voices, and increase civic engagement without more COVID recovery information dissemination and assistance. And concurrently, COVID recovery will be partly dependent on both past and present civic engagement efforts, particularly the 2020 census. Now, the 2020 census, as it was originally planned, was decimated by the pandemic, as so many of us moved to homeschooling and teleworking on March 13th. The annual census day was slated to be just 2 weeks later. Field operations across the nation ceased. Census form distributions halted, and advocacy campaigns, ours included, paused. At the same time, the former administration sought to change the actual counting of America, challenging not just centuries of practice, but our very Constitution. The fear and anxiety stoked by the effort of former President Trump's executive memorandum to cull undocumented persons from the rolls and create a new list was palpable, and it did nothing to help communities build trust or want to actually participate in the decennial count. Under the Biden administration, those efforts have already been reversed in several ways, including the day one executive order undoing the past memorandum of his predecessor. However, much of this damage may be lasting, and it will be up to organizations like FairCount, our partners all throughout South Strong, and those leading organizations around the nation to double down on our efforts to build that trust back using the American Community Survey, resource delivery information from the 2020 census, and other iterations of engagement, namely voting and redistricting. And Dr. Jeanine Abrams McLean, I'll turn it over to you to speak to that.
Thank you, Rebecca. Good morning, everyone. It will also be up to us to build new coalitions, particularly in undercounted communities and news deserts, to bridge the gaps in services, data collection, resources, and more. Not only does this follow the ideals of non-extractive organizing, but it also allows organizations to act in real time to successfully build power. I'm going to tell you a few examples of how this work will look going forward this year in conjunction with this partnership. FairCount knew going into a primarily online census that more than 20% of people in Georgia didn't have reliable access to high-speed internet. So we began a program installing internet hubs in locations where people already go and feel comfortable: community centers, barbershops, churches, and more. We gifted devices and committed to paying for the data for a year. What started out small has grown to more than 160 community-based internet hubs. People completed their census, attended job fairs to get good census jobs, and later registered to vote or applied for their vote by mail ballots using these hubs. When the pandemic hit, these hubs became places where families could plug in for kids to do homework and where faith institutions could broadcast sermons online, saving communities from in-person gatherings. We have committed to paying for the data in all of these areas for 2021, and we have a goal of at least 200 installations in Georgia. Now, going forward, we will build programs with local partners across the state to provide information on COVID relief, recovery, and vaccination efforts at all locations, helping to fill the gaps where there are news deserts and continuing to provide connectivity in safe community-centered spaces. Unfortunately, this wide digital divide is not unique to Georgia. And we're looking forward to working with community partners across the South to share best practices and solutions to help bridge the gap. Between the census, the general election, and the runoff election, FairCount distributed more than 750,000 paper and cloth masks, along with civic engagement materials to communities throughout rural Georgia, Mississippi, Louisiana, and North Florida. Coupling these efforts together made good on our non-extractive promise, and it created an economy of resource exchange. FairCount will continue its PPE program in all states that we work in, while we actively organize around building people and community-centered power in the upcoming redistricting process. Additionally, during the redistricting process, we can use COVID recovery as a launching point to talk about representation and why historically the same populations, namely those of color, have had representation ripped from them, and how the power of communities choosing their elected officials rather than politicians choosing their constituents will be critical in bringing real recovery policy, resources, and efforts to the areas most in need. Now, if you grew up in the rural South like me, you know that access to information can sometimes be limited. And as you just learned, Southern communities are more likely to be news deserts. We want to ensure that everyone has access to the information that is key to our recovery. So we'll be working with local newspapers and trusted voices and communities across the South to make sure people get the information they need to recover and thrive. Lastly, FairCount knows that communities undercounted in the census are the same communities underrepresented at the polls and the same communities who, although often in dire need, are not getting the COVID recovery they need. We are excited to launch this program today in partnership with NCOC and SEEP. We expect these efforts to grow over time, and we will share that growth with you. However, we cannot do this without you, and your community can't recover and prosper without your help. So we'll be reaching back out with opportunities for you to get involved. And I've seen a lot of comments in the, a lot of questions in the comments about however people can get involved. So stay tuned for that. Now it is my pleasure to turn this program over to our partners at the Southern Economic Advancement Project, or SEAP.
Thank you so much, Jeanine and Rebecca. Now it is my pleasure to introduce my colleague at SEAP, Dr. Sarah Beth Gehl, who serves as our research director. She served as policy director for the Stacey Abrams for Governor campaign and previously served as deputy director for the Georgia Budget and Policy Institute, where she specialized in tax policy. Take it away, Sarah Beth.
Thanks so much, Jenny, Jeanine and Rebecca, and everyone in the Pandemic to Prosperity South. As Jenny said, I am the research director of the Southern Economic Advancement Project, or SEAP. We're an initiative founded by leader Stacey Abrams in 2019 and housed at the Roosevelt Institute. We focus on issues of economic security, health, and climate in 12 Southern states and work to amplify the efforts of existing organizations who are on the ground every day doing this work. We do that through technical assistance, research support, microgrants, and network building across the region. During COVID-19, we have sought to lift up the South's particular vulnerabilities in the pandemic that are driven by underfunded, weak, and often exclusionary public systems. That includes underfunded public health infrastructure, weak protections for workers, and weak supports for the unemployed, families, and children. We are so excited about the upcoming Pandemic to Prosperity South report because we know it will highlight both within the region and nationally what's happening in the South, what the challenges are, and help build this framework that we can all work from to respond and recover. To move forward, we need to understand the problem, which is what Pandemic to Prosperity South is all about. We need to set an agenda and create accountability. What we think is needed now in 2021, first and foremost, is Medicaid expansion. The South has been slow and stubborn to expand Medicaid, and that's had severe consequences for our healthcare system. We as a nation have kind of accidentally run an experiment because some states expanded Medicaid for years now, and most of the Southern states have not. So we see what happens. The Southern states that have not expanded Medicaid have the highest uninsured rates and the most failing rural hospitals. This experiment has shown us that Medicaid works. Study after study, hundreds of them, show that it works for lowering the uninsured rate, bringing down costs, expanding mental health access, and saving mothers' lives. We know that it works, and it is not too late for Southern states to join the majority of other states that have expanded Medicaid and draw down billions of federal dollars into our healthcare systems. The second policy priority that we'd like to talk about is the fast and equitable distribution of COVID vaccines. As Denice, Allison, and their colleagues presented, we know that there's both slowness in distribution in some Southern states and some data gaps that are occurring so that we don't have the full picture of what's happening. To ensure an equitable distribution, we need public information on vaccines in multiple languages for our diverse region. We need equity assessments like some communities performed in COVID testing to make sure vaccine sites are accessible, and community health navigators to help people figure out this system. We need to learn from census work like Fair Count on how we reach those hard to reach populations, and we need better data. On this and several of the other indicators that were covered, it is clear that we need better data collection, capacity, coordination, and transparency in the South. Many states now have the position of chief data officer at the state level, whose job it is to coordinate data across systems and ensure that the public and elected officials have the transparent information needed to guide decisions. Perhaps unsurprisingly, many Southern states do not have this position of chief data officer, and we think it's time that states take a hard look at creating that position. Under economic assistance, we need direct relief to the people most in need. There have been important supports already, including stimulus checks through the CARES Act, expanded unemployment compensation, increased SNAP, eviction moratoriums. We know more is needed. SEAP did a survey with Propel through the Fresh EBT app to ask vulnerable Southerners what was most needed. 2,300 Southerners responded, and we heard time and again, food, rent, utilities, and childcare. We need additional stimulus and supports, and we need sustained direct relief to people until this pandemic is over. One check is not enough. We're very excited that there's already talk and action on this in DC, but we know that state and local governments are so important in this as well. We know that some of these supports for individuals rely on state and local implementation. So while it's important to focus on DC, it's also important to focus on our local communities. We're likely to see very significant federal dollars flowing into states and communities. But if our state and local systems aren't up to the task, then those supports are not going to reach the people they are intended to help. So one important question to ask at this moment is, how did your community spend CARES Act funds? That's probably a pretty good indication of what might happen in this next round of stimulus. One city here in Georgia, for example, created rental assistance programs, childcare grants, hazard pay, internet access grants. Another city here in Georgia that had the same poverty rate of 30% as the first city, they spent all the dollars on the police department. Engagement in your community will be more important than ever as these federal dollars start flowing to make sure they reach the people in need. Next, we need federal aid to state and local governments, fiscal relief for their budgets. Now is not the time to make cuts in the very public systems that are responding to this pandemic. We need to invest in education, public health, broadband, labor departments. There are some southern states that have wild tax changes in conversation right now, like doing away with the income tax. Now is not the time to poke holes in our revenue systems. Now is the time to shore up our revenue systems to make sure that they are strong enough to get us through both this crisis and the next one, because we know there will be another recession, another tornado or hurricane, and we need to invest now. We're also lifting up the Southeast Crescent Regional Commission as a priority. There are regional commissions across the US, the oldest being the Appalachian Regional Commission. The ARC has been around since the 1960s, investing in communities in Appalachia to fight poverty, expand childcare and job training, and invest in transportation and other infrastructure. The Black Belt of the South, stretching from Virginia to Alabama, has not had that same investment in spite of having the highest poverty rates, the legacy of slavery, and generational underinvestment. In 2008, Congress created the Southeast Crescent Regional Commission, but unfortunately has never been funded, even as the ARC has received $165 million each year. The SCRC has also not had a federal co-chair named. We and other organizations across the region are calling for a federal co-chair to be named and for significant appropriation to be made that recognizes that for a generation, the Black Belt has not received the same attention that other regions have. We believe that the SCRC is an infrastructure that can mirror what has happened with other regional commissions, but also that we can be bolder and use this state-federal partnership to tackle additional challenges such as climate, rural broadband, rural healthcare, and rural childcare. And finally, childcare. We have all recognized how critical childcare is in this pandemic, as childcare facilities have closed or have attempted to stay afloat and stay open for essential workers and their children. We know that the backbone of the economy is care workers. Now is the time for states and local communities to take a hard look at what's been lost in terms of this infrastructure and what's needed to strengthen us in recovery. Those are the priorities that SEAT puts forward for 2021. And we're working on a number of different reports that are coming out in the coming weeks on regional commissions, health policy, community-centered development as an employment model. Next slide, please. We've also been coordinating a campaign to engage organizations and academics across the region to push for a better post-pandemic South. More than 187 organizations and scholars have signed on to South Strong to call for an equity-centered, people-first response to COVID-19. We're focused on the policy and data that need to be front and center in recovery. We have a media and narrative strategy that is helping organizations communicate the story of what they're seeing in the pandemic. And finally, civic engagement. We're mapping what organizations are doing across the South in the COVID recovery and providing a space for groups to engage on accountability, relationship building, and other tactics they're using. Groups across the South have stepped up to this moment and are leading the way in making sure their communities survive the health and economic consequences of the pandemic. I hope that you'll consider joining us by visiting southstrong.org and signing on today to learn how you can be a part of this network that is pushing for a stronger South. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah Beth. We really appreciate that. Now, please welcome Hillary Hawley, who is currently the Director of Organizing for Fair Fight Action, where she manages all grassroots volunteers, partnerships with allied organizations, and building a grassroots and grass tops network to fight for voting rights and government accountability. Hillary?
Thank you so much, Jenny, and thank you everyone for joining. As someone who was born and raised in Georgia and has never lived out of the state, I'm just truly grateful for this event because, as you've seen today, the South is historically and consistently left behind. Fair Fight Action's mission is to fight and mitigate voter suppression, not only because we believe that the right to vote is sacred, but because we know that elections matter and elections can change lives. And because of Georgia's collective work, we were able to mitigate voter suppression enough so Georgia voters could have a voice and historically change America's political landscape. And voters showed up this year because, as Sarah Beth said, they want Medicaid expansion. They want equitable vaccine distribution, racial justice, and COVID relief. And now the election is over, we have a chance to deliver for these voters and Southerners specifically. And so I'm going to keep it really short. It's my honor to introduce Stacey Abrams, who is founder of Fair Fight Action, Fair Count, and SEEP. She knows that fair elections and a fair count and fair maps can lead to life-saving public policies, especially for Southerners. And so, Leader Abrams, I want to thank you for all you do for the South and for America, and I'll kick it off to you.
Thank you so much, Hillary, and thank you to Rebecca and Jeanine, to Sarah Beth and Genny, and to Denice and Allison for the partnership that is continuing to build strength and progress in the South. When I founded these organizations, let me take my glasses off, they're reflecting the light. When I founded these organizations, Fair Fight, Fair Count, and the Southern Economic Advancement Project, the goal was to build an ecosystem, one that understood that we have to have a robust and thriving democracy to make progress, that we had to have a census that accurately counted who we are and fairly distributed the resources and the political power to build our progress, and that the Southern Economic Advancement Project would be the seat of policymaking and policy identification, recognizing that we have organizations that have been working hard for decades to keep us afloat and sometimes even to move us forward, but that it required that we fill in the gaps that were missing in these organizations and across this ecosystem. The partnership with the National Center on Citizenship and certainly the data organization that Dr. Plyer leads, these are important relationships and friendships that will help us move the South forward. We are talking about this in a moment of absolute agony, where we know that COVID-19 continues to ravage our communities, where families are still waiting for any kind of relief, and where there is no clear understanding of what recovery will look like. I know that the elections are done and we are facing a new administration, one that has committed publicly to a recovery plan that includes all of us. We have a U.S. Senate and a U.S. House that have spoken aloud that they believe that it is their responsibility to deliver a recovery plan as well as an interim relief plan. But the reality is that government doesn't just exist in DC. We have state and local governments that are also hard at work figuring out what their responsibilities are. And we know that at the state level, budgets are already under consideration. That as legislatures convene, they've got two jobs. One is to pass a budget, and the second is to decide later on this year what the lines of power will look like. Our mission is to make certain that we are in those conversations from the very beginning. I served in the state legislature in Georgia for 11 years. My first year as the leader in the House for the Democratic Party as the minority leader, my job was to first get us through another recession budget and then to deal with reapportionment and redistricting. These are tough conversations, but these are conversations that too often lack the voices of those most impacted by the decisions. I know what this means, and I know what's next. What's next is that the federal government will make decisions about allocations of funding. State governments will then receive those dollars and decide how they will disperse it to local governments, and local governments will decide how they spend those dollars with all of the constraints that come from each of those levels of government. And the reality is, unfortunately, most of the people we serve are going to be the last thought and at the very bottom of that flow. And so it is our job to use our power to stand up stronger and to show up earlier. What is next for us as we as the South demand our fair share and our rightful place is that we have to be present in every one of these conversations. We have to be present during the debates about stimulus, but also about recovery. We have to be present in the conversations about how small businesses are renewed, understanding that for the South, where we've had some of the highest rates of mass incarceration, we have to make certain that new entrepreneurs who are getting their lives back together are included in these budgets. We have to understand that for small businesses started by people of color, their pathway to profitability is a little bit longer, and therefore PPP programs have to understand that profitability cannot be one of the metrics for paying out for keeping people on the payrolls. And we have to understand that childcare is essential to the future of our nation, because the people we need to be back at work cannot go to work if they can't take care of their children. But we also have to recognize that childcare providers, who are almost exclusively women and are predominantly women of color, have lost their livelihoods and deserve to have relief and support to rebuild. These are the conversations we're going to be having over the next few months. These are conversations that will actually stretch over the next few years. And I am so excited about the roles that each of us can play and how we make certain that what is next is our success. I want to look to and speak to the organizations that are doing this work, that are having conversations, some of them cloaked in fear. And we need to understand that the South demonstrated once again how powerful we are when we are organized. Regardless of your partisanship, it was the South that surprised America with its participation in elections. And that gives us a power that we have not had before, a power to demand attention and to demand action and engagement. And so we need to look at these elections not as a victory or a defeat for any party, but as an opportunity for the South to demand success. And so organizations that are worried about being involved in political advocacy, I urge you to talk to your attorneys, but understand that it is not against any rules for us to lift up the people we serve and ask for the help we need. To those of you who are in the space of helping support these organizations as funders, as volunteers, we have to recognize that we cannot wait. Those budgets that are being decided right now by these groups, these are budgets that are going to need to be plussed up because there's a lot of work to do. The fight over the census is a fight that is going to be waged for quite some time. The Biden administration is replacing the director of the census. And we know that there has been a challenge with the collection of data because of the pandemic, but also because of the weaponization of the census under the previous administration. We have to be vigilant, ensuring that we have accurate data and accurate information that can make certain that for the next decade of our lives, that the right story is told about who we are and we have the information we need. And if you have groups that come to you saying, we want to be a part of this fight, we need you to support those groups. But fundamentally, we need to make certain the stories are told. To those of you in the press who are on this call, we thank you for joining us, but I urge you to look to the organizations that are in your communities. The stories that they have to tell are the stories of where we are and where we can be. These are stories that must be told, because otherwise we are using national data to make local decisions, and that is not right. We must tell the local stories, and we must repeat those stories, not only of tragedy, but of success, of innovation, of perseverance. There is an ecosystem that is being created in the South that has been burgeoning for decades. And we have an opportunity to use the tragedy of COVID-19, to use the tragedy of this pandemic to build prosperity and progress for all. I believe that this is possible because I know who's at work. I know that there are more than 180 organizations that make the South strong. I know there are 4 organizations on this call that are dedicated and committed to moving our nation forward and making our region the vital region that it can be. But most of all, I know that everyone listening to this call understands and believes in the people in their communities. They understand and believe in the possibility of working together, of cutting across partisanship and geography, against race and ethnic divisions, to decide that we can work together to rise. Because ultimately, that is our mission. We are a strong region. We are a vital region, but we are a region that's been left behind. Now is our time. This is our stand. And together we can move from pandemic to prosperity.
Thank you so much, Leader Abrams. Thank you to Fair Count, to SEEP, and to NCOC. We are so happy to be a part of this conversation and this dialogue. We've seen the data, heard the work, and are seeing the partnerships live right on this call. And we want to answer some questions that we've gotten in the chat. So for our speakers, I want to go ahead and bring you all back to the stage and see what insight you all can add to these conversations and the questions that we've gotten from our guests. One of our first questions that we've gotten, we saw a lot of some themes here, so I'll answer that one at the end. But wanting to go ahead and ask the question to the folks here from Nathan Babb. In Florida, until yesterday, in-state residency wasn't required to receive a vaccine. How does vaccine tourism like that impact vaccination data collection? Denice, would you like to offer your insight on this?
Yeah, Nathan, I'm so glad you asked that. As I mentioned, vaccines are allocated to states based on their populations. So out-of-state vaccine tourism messes up those equations and it pushes out locals. Florida has a relatively high vaccine rate at 5%. That's above the national average of 4.1%. So as I was looking at those numbers, I was wondering what role vaccine tourism played in potentially pushing that number up a bit.
Thank you for that. We have a question from Wendy Padilla. For news deserts, are there nonprofits that can fill the void and disseminate news? And I know that Jeanine and Denice had spoken about news deserts, and I was wondering if you all would be able to offer a little bit insight about how nonprofits can help.
Sure, I'll start with that. Yes, and Fair Count is one of those nonprofits that will be working to help get that out. But it's not so it's not just the nonprofits. It's also working with individuals in these communities. So if you're in a community that has a weekly newspaper that has an editorial section, we want to be able to work with you to give you the data that is relevant to your community so that you can write something. You're a trusted voice. And that's what we're really going to need, are trusted voices in these communities, these small towns, these small counties, to really get out there and share the information in ways that resonate with people and that get your community engaged. And so, yes, we will be working with the nonprofits. There are several or dozens and dozens of nonprofits that have already signed up for the South Strong initiative. And so we'll be working with them and then individuals. And like I said, we will be reaching out after this to get folks involved and engaged in making sure that the South prospers.
Thank you so much, Jeanine. Denice, do you want to add anything?
I just wanted to add that a great place to start is the research at the University of North Carolina's Center for Innovation and Sustainability in Local Media. You can find them online at usnewsdeserts.com.
Thank you for that. A question from Leela McKnight. Who in southern states is covered in the data that determine the percentage of vaccines administered? Who would like to take that on?
I can add that. State eligibility guidelines vary by state, but they are broadening over time. Nursing home residents and staff, as well as healthcare workers and the oldest Americans, are typically at the top of the list. But the data that we presented is a total for the state that has been reported to the CDC.
Thank you for that. Christopher Mass asked, looking at the race info, curious to know if there's age and race data effects on older African-American and API communities in particular. Would the folks at NCOC be able to provide some information on that?
Sure, and I can take that one. There's a lot of breakdowns of the data. I think Christopher must be referring to the internet access information that we presented. And that comes from the American Community Survey. There's a lot of different kinds of breakdowns. Certainly older Americans have less access to computers and internet in general, many of them in rural areas. So yeah, it would be great to get in touch with you, sir, and have a little bit more of a conversation. You could perhaps email us and we could find out more of what you're looking for and how we can get those breakdowns to you.
Thank you so much. And for everybody on the stage, for all of our organizations that are here, we've received many, many questions about how can folks get involved in the South, help the South, and really uplift the South in the work that we're doing here. Hillary, would you like to start?
Sure. And so because now that elections are over, as I said, the work continues. We are already seeing voter suppression tactics come into the Georgia legislature and other legislatures across the South and country. And so we're going to continue to fight because we need to continue to have voters be able to use their voice. So all the people on this call can help make sure that we have policies that can save lives. So for people who want to get involved, specifically in the fight for voting rights, you can go to fairfight.com. And regardless of where you are in the country, we will circle back soon and help you get plugged in to help fight for voting rights in your state.
Thanks, Hillary. From fair fight to fair count. Rebecca, can you provide some information to our audience?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for wanting to get involved. It really is going to take all of us. The first thing today, please visit us online at faircount.org. Sign up for our newsletter. We communicate with folks regularly and on social media, and we'll be following up with all participants here as well. But another big thing we can support in this new year is the bipartisan legislation that is coming down through DC to give the 2020 census the time it needs to go through and ensure data integrity, and then to ensure that the numbers that are reported for apportionment and for redistricting are reflective of whole persons in every state. More legislation will be dropped. It is a bipartisan effort, and it really needs all of us to really kind of raise it up, because while the census doesn't always seem like the most exciting thing, it's really the bedrock for our democracy and for civic engagement. And if we don't count all people, we won't serve all people. So please keep an eye on that news.
Thank you for that, Rebecca. Anybody from NCOC or Sarah Beth from SEEP want to add?
Yeah, I'll just jump in and do a plug again for southstrong.org. This is primarily has been for organizations and academics who want to get involved in recovery efforts, to share ideas, spread good ideas around the region, to think through accountability tactics and different policy areas. But we've actually put an individual sign-on link just this week onto southstrong.org so that individuals can get involved as well. Elected officials can get involved as well. There's a link for them to really sign on to the values of South Strong, which is an equity-centered, people-first recovery in a post-pandemic South. And so we hope that folks will visit and sign on. We do storytelling workshops, op-ed help, policy development, and then civic engagement tools. And so would hope that everyone would get involved there. And then the other thing I would reiterate that I spoke about earlier is please think about how to get involved with your city and county commission as these federal dollars flow to your community. So how can we get as many people to fill that budget room as possible to really engage with local leaders and say, this is where the dollars need to go for our community?
Would anybody from NCOC like to offer one last way to get involved with your organization?
I'll briefly just put a call out that when the Pandemic to Prosperity South report is released next Thursday, please forward it to your friends and colleagues so we all have a common base of shared information. And as you're engaged in all of this fantastic advocacy, set aside some time to talk about the need for transparency and accountability and investment in data infrastructure so we can keep these data flowing.
That is wonderful. Thank you so much, Denise. I want to just thank everybody here for your insight, for your support, and for your passion for this work. It is a lot that we work for, a lot of people that we'll never actually meet, but we will be impacting for everything that we're doing. So thank you so much for everything that you're doing. Please, everybody who's on the line, follow these organizations. We really want to get this information to you and work to make sure that we're building a stronger South, but one that also the world will keep its eye on, because when the South makes things happen, so does the whole world. So we want to make sure that folks are involved, are getting the information that they need. We would love to hear from you. For the folks whose questions weren't answered here live, don't worry, we have your email. So we will be making sure that you will get some of these questions answered and getting all the up-to-date information about different events that we have as a collective, but also as separate organizations. Thank you so much to Leader Abrams and her vision for the work that she has done, for being here with us today. For all of our organizations, we wish you a wonderful weekend, and please make sure to follow us on all social media. And thank you all so much for the time and the attention.